Welcome everyone to this ad hoc special talk with Doug, Quantum Doug, as we affectionately know him. He's going to talk for around about 45 minutes about um, quantum mind and quantum spirituality. So over to you, Doug.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen here, and here we go. So I call this a chat with quantum scientists because, I'm interested in quantum computing, but I'm also interested in quantum physics. Okay, so I call myself a quantum scientist, but I'm specifically interested in that the mind is not the brain, and the mind, in fact, is something else other than matters, space, time, matter, and energy. Right. So what is that? And so I talk about the quantum mind in that context. And I wrote a book 4 years ago already, released 4 years ago, called Deep Reality, and I talk about it in that book. And my co-author of this was a famous guy named Bill Tiller, who's now deceased. And and I call this area, I call it source science. So it includes the science of the source of all things, and you could also think of it at the source for quantum mechanics and source for mind too. So anyhow, that's sort of the talk. And, here's a summary of my background. I'll just put it up here for a minute, but I'm a technical guy, but yet I'm interested in metaphysics. Okay. And so I've been working, Spirit has been guiding me through all this to get a PhD in quantum computing 23 years ago already. And I built this tool, and I'm still using that tool to work with bit physics. I call it bit physics, and it's a simulation environment. It's a quantum computing using geometric algebra, but it's a symbolic math tool to work on this stuff with. And, I've been working on both neural computing and quantum computing, so I understand both. So when people talk about AI and ChatGPT and large language models and stuff like that, I look at all of that from the perspective of quantum mind. And so I call it real intelligence is what I'm interested in. So here's that thing about the book. I worked on NLP, which includes things like timeline, stuff like that. And then I also founded a company, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end. So here, can you come up with a model? Can engineers help us figure out what is the experience that we have when we have either Kundalini or spiritually transformative experiences like an NDE? Can we talk about that? Well, yeah, it's more than just consciousness. It's the ability to be aware and experience and access memories and make decisions and decide, oh, I'm going to come back or not going to come back. Those are all informational properties, right? And awareness, advanced awareness. Like if you're aware of everything in the room in all 360 degrees in all directions, in front, behind, up and down, all simultaneously, that is an information paradigm. It's massively parallel awareness of computing awareness, if you want to think about it. And so how is that possible? And so those are the kinds of things I'm interested in from a technology perspective. But basically, I'm trying to explain for people that this awareness is informational centric. It's not energy centric, right? Because this awareness is done without the body necessarily sometimes, right? With an NDE, or if you're traveling the cosmos in your light body, but you don't have a physical body around. Okay, so how do you do all of that? Okay, and so part of that is this notion of group consciousness and telepathy. And anytime you're interacting with these other beings, these other spiritual guides and this other stuff and past lives, you have telepathy. Telepathy is part of that, and telepathy is essentially meaning without electromagnetic energy, right? So how do you do that? Let's talk about this a little bit more. So a lot of this is obvious to this group, right? So it's classical versus the spiritual world, right? Most people who are working on AI assumes the brain is a classical computer, and therefore we can build a physical computer that does the same thing as the brain. And that's what AI is all about. And it turns out it's useful, and they're using math that's simulating the kind of math that exists in the quantum realm. So this notion of hyperdimensional spaces. And so, but most people don't have a quantum background. and yet a lot of other people don't have informational background. So there's physicists who don't have enough information science, and they don't necessarily believe in metaphysics. And so they're not solving the whole problem. They're only looking at part of the problem, and it's useful. And consciousness is more of a curiosity, but it's not really understood. There's consciousness conference has been going on for 30 years, and they're not much closer to understanding it anymore than they were 30 years ago, but they keep talking about it, right? So, and death leads to the apparent extinction of the mind. So, and that's what generates fear. But the transcendent worldview is that the mind exists independent of the brain. And this is all stuff you guys already know. And my language is there's this quantum hyperbit cloud. And that's what our mind is. Essentially, it's a cohesion of a bunch of information structures. And that represents our unique being, okay? And that survives multiple lives and is love centric. And part of my interest in it is well, you can have infinite intelligence in that space because you can have more and more complexity. There's no limit to the complexity you can have. There, infinite intelligence is a word that they use with Abraham and law of attraction, right? So you can have infinite love too, which people experience when they connect with source, right? And so how is it that you can have these experiences with infinite intelligence and infinite love, and meaning? You can have all of a sudden, like, everything, anything that you want to know, you can have. Essentially, you're tapping into the Akashic records if you want to use that language, right? So anyhow, these are the things that I'm trying to understand and help people who are experiencing it get a reality. First of all, it's real. Science can talk about it. We can talk about it better than the people who have the classical worldview, because these are like two camps, and I'm trying to find more physicists and people who believe in the transcendent worldview but want to combine the science and spirit sides of things, and so that's what I call source science. So anytime you have a transcendent experience like this, you can abruptly shift your worldview, and a lot of people have a hard time going, oh, now that I know that this is how the universe is really built, what does that mean for my everyday mundane life? And so there's a lot of people who have trouble integrating either Kundalini awakening or near-death experience, any kind of spiritually transformative experience that you can never forget, right? No going back. You're fundamentally different as a result of this. And how do you do that? So a lot of people tell their story, and those stories are very enlightening because they are all trying to integrate what they learned by these experiences as they come back. Well, there are people that can help. I have a friend who's a quantum psychologist, she calls herself, and she helps people who are trying to integrate those things. And she and I spend a lot of time talking about these ideas, because I'm Quantum Doug and she's a quantum psychologist. And so we have a lot to say about each other, about that. So if you're interested in that, her name is Valerie Vereb. So science can explain transcendence, is really the key. The mind is primarily informational. And so imagine as the mind is a hyperdimensional quantum bit cloud, hyperbits, which supports all thought, meaning, emotions, attention, intention, focus, memory, decisions, plus all metaphysical phenomena. And so it turns out that you can talk about this by looking at this hierarchy of definitions here. This is a thing called bits are physical, Landauer's principle. Basically, it says you can't ignore information in physics anymore, because the surface area of a black hole is bits. If you throw something in the black hole, the smallest increment you can make is a bit. So this is, you can't ignore information. If you erase information, you have to account for it somewhere from a thermodynamics perspective. But I go beyond that. I say bits are physical, but they're not, you can't ignore them. But I say bits are really proto-physical. This is what I call my Matsky's principle, tongue-in-cheek, because you can just have mathematics, and the mathematics exists before the physical. And so you can form bits in a mathematical perspective, and those bits also have an effect on the physical world, but they're not of the physical world. They're literally mathematical stuff. So there's this hierarchy of bits exist, and they exist in the physical world, but they also exist in the mathematical world. So that's what my PhD was all about, and still working on it 20 years later. And then to remind you that part of my work is that these bits, they're not just like toothpicks all stacked up in 3 dimensions. No, each of these bits is its own dimension. So we have a hard time imagining 2 dimensions. We can readily do that 2 dimensions, and we can also see 3 dimensions. That's a cube. And then, but if you go to a 4 dimension, most people have a hard time imagining what 4 dimension is. Well, imagine what it is a 20-dimensional object is. Okay. Well, it turns out if you have a 20 or 100-dimensional object, it's just imagine a cube that has 100 dimensions on top. So it's a cube with each corner has 100 dimensions out of it. Okay. And it has unusual mathematical properties, which is the same mathematical properties that is the law of attraction. Turns out things that are similar to each other in these dimensional addresses, if you want to think about them that way, are near each other in this space, and things that are not near each other in this space are randomly distanced apart from you. So it's the bullseye model. So remember, anytime you think about something, you're actually looking at the meaning, the address of the meaning in the space. And that's what I mean is this hyperdimensional property of standard distance and essentially law of attraction. Law of attraction says light things are near each other in the space. So love is an epicenter, is the bullseye here. And then the love of your mother and the love of your children and the love of your wife, and all of the different loves that you have are all near it in that space with a lot of overlap in the addresses. But some of them are slightly different, and those variants cause a halo of love around that. Okay. So that's the idea. So these are sort of the fundamental properties that you can say, science can talk about this. Okay. So this is the starting point. And it's also the starting point in my book too. So, and I say that these hyperdimensional bits, I call them hyperbits, is the basis of real intelligence. That's why humans are really smart. Versus artificial intelligence, which is only simulating those dimensions in 3 space. So it's the difference between actual simulation of hyperdimensional space versus actually having a hyperdimensional space. And there are fundamentally different properties that you get when you do that. One of them is performance. You have a lot more. You can be really intelligent. You can be hyper smart, infinite intelligence, if you're not simulating, but actually using those actual dimensions to be intelligent. So, and that's what happens when you have an experience like this, hyperbit minds. You experience the source. This is somebody's vision of you have a near-death experience, and you are in front of the angels and the source, and you experience this all connected. And how can we explain that if we're trying to use regular physics to do this? Well, we can't. But in a hyperdimensional space, this is literally a hyperdimensional space, and that's the source. So I don't know, maybe Kundalini people have this kind of experience too, where they experience the source. Somebody would have to add, if somebody wants to add their note about that, they are welcome to, or comment about that. So we'll have more time for questions and answers at the end. But this is what I consider an important problem, because this is the experience that people have when they have NDEs, and I'm assuming they have something similar to this when they have other spiritually transformative experiences like a Kundalini awakening. So also, the other one is you go through this tunnel. Okay, well, what is this tunnel? It's where you're stepping out of space-time. Your mind is stopping paying attention to space-time and your brain. And then all of a sudden, this tunnel with essentially that light on there is the source light. And essentially, space itself isolates it from each other. So it looks like we're individuals, but we're not. It's just an illusion because we're paying attention to a point in our brain, which is inside space-time. But what the tunnel is we're walking out of space-time, and that light is all of a sudden the information of everything in the universe available to us. That's what that is. Okay, which is essentially what the source is too. It's the sum of all possible information in the universe. And we would call that God, right? To be all-knowing, right? So those are the kinds of words that I would use that describe what we experience as source or God or whatever we call that. And that's what we're doing here too. We're stepping out of space-time. So I don't know if a Kundalini has any kind of tunnel like this or not, but they certainly have this experience where you you all of a sudden you're aware of everything, right? So you're in the focal point where space and time are no longer limits to your perception and your awareness and your sentience. And so now you can see everything because you're one with everything. You're not disconnected by your attention limited by space and time anymore, right? And so we would call this a life review in an NDE thing, but only because time disappears. And so it's like we're a panoramic time, I call it, right? It's like you're above time, you're outside of time, and you're above time, like above the Grand Canyon. You're looking at the Grand Canyon from a panoramic view. Well, you're looking at your whole life's time from a panoramic perspective. Okay. And so they put it in a circle here, but imagine that you could see all time, all information from all time of your life and past lives too. And so Kundalini awakening, I think, is the same kind of thing. You awaken, all of a sudden, you're aware of absolutely everything around you, in front of you, behind you, above you, below you, remotely. You can know who's in the next room. People who have NDEs, they know their famous Dying to Be Me, the lady who wrote Dying to Be Me. She says she was aware of the doctors in the next hospital room when she was in the coma and have a near-death experience. And she was also aware of her brother coming on the plane because she was supposed to be dying, right? And so your awareness is wherever you can put your attention to. And this is the same thing you can do in a lucid dream. So if you want to practice doing this, which is what the Eastern monks and studies say, you can practice what you're going to do if you were to die by practicing this in your lucid dreams, right? So I'm thinking lucid dreams are important, and I'm not as good at it as I'd like, or even dream control in general. But you have to have a model for explaining how can we have awareness of all this stuff, but also how is this, like we have a near-death experience, one of the things you have is you might have an experience where somebody picked on you or you picked on somebody else when you were young. And when you experience that life review, it's not judgment, it's just you're experiencing it in full fidelity. And that full fidelity is literally, you're at that point in space-time again. You're not remembering it. You're at that point in space-time. And now you have full fidelity of everybody else's emotions as well as your own emotions at that point in space-time. You've sort of time traveled to that point. You're not remembering it. You're actually there. And now you can actually be aware of things that you weren't aware of at the time. And you can experience everybody else's emotions as well as your emotions. And you can also see the ripple effect of the consequence of that event, of that interaction in the future, and your effect on everybody. So the life review is about this understanding how everything is connected, and it's only possible to do that if you have this expanded awareness and you're not limited by space and time anymore, and it's information centric. So this is an important idea, that this is who we really are, and we forget that, and especially when we're in our body all the time. This is I don't have very many technical slides, but this is one of them. Just to put it in perspective, is like everybody's used to people, blood cells, atoms, and stuff like that. But most people don't, and they know about everything that's going on with electrons. This is the particle model of physics. But most people don't know that there's this whole nother domain down here called Planck scale. And it's big. This is 10 to the minus 24th, and this is 10 to the minus 36. So it's another minus 12 degree exponential powers of stuff. And eventually you get down to here, and this is the domain of Planck scale and Planck's length and quantum foam and bits. In a bit is related to the Planck area on a black hole. And so, but I say that there's this line here, and below this line, you're not in space-time anymore. So consciousness is below this line. It's not above the line, and it's not even at the line. It's below this line. And so that's what I'm working on, that there's no space, there's no time. There are no metrics. Distance and frequency and time, seconds don't exist in this domain. Change exists, and these relationships exist, and topologies exist, and entanglement exists. But all of those things are completely independent of space and time. It's pure mathematical topology, if you want to think about it. This is the stuff that the source is made of. This is the real stuff. And that's not a reductionist model, because these properties have all the properties of quantum computing. And they all also have all the properties of quantum computing, including entanglement, which means this is all, from the perspective of inside time, this is all what's called space-like, that they can have interactions because it's a hyperdimensional space. You can have interactions through these other dimensions that you can't have if you're limited by 3 dimensions. So this is all called space-like in physics. It's the light cone. So just be aware that don't use language that puts you above this line. Use the language that puts you below this line, and that puts less limits on how you think about what's happening to you or your experiences. Okay. There is no electromagnetics down here. I use the Slinky model. The Slinky model, think of it as a structure that when you put it on a steps in a gravitational well, it does the step down the step, Slinky down, one step at a time. So a structure can form a pattern in space-time. Well, that's what I'm interested in. These structures that form the pattern that we know as atoms and electrons and neutrons and primitive particles and forces like a photon, that those are all Slinky models of what's the topology that's happening down here. And then because it's informational oriented, then it's all constrained by topology laws and constraint laws. Any kind of conservation laws in physics is because of topology constraints in this lower level bit physics. Okay, so use, anytime you think about this one slide, anytime you think about my language, where's my language putting me on this scale? And if you really want to do your job right, you should. And that's what I talk about in my book, to redefine how you use your language, because your language, this is a neuro-linguistic programming thing. Your language reflects how you think. And so if somebody's saying something, you can have a pretty good idea how they're thinking because of how the language they use. Likewise, you can change your language and it affects your thinking. It's a two-way street. They're cooperating environments. How you think informs your language, how you talk about it, and how you talk about it affects your thinking about it. So I tell everybody, change your language to change the way you think. And so be aware that your language is limiting you. Okay, so this is right out of neuro-linguistic programming. Okay. So then what is consciousness then? Hyperbits can cohere or cluster or combine to form individual souls and minds. But you can also have a group consciousness. So let's say this is a pictorial representation of one consciousness. Notice that this is in a hyperdimensional space. It has these grids, but imagine this is a gazillion dimensional space, and this is just a subset of it that I've put as this little cluster, this little cloud. Notice there's no fields in anywhere here. There's no space and time. It's just this clustering that's going on. And this is another cluster. Well, these two things can combine in a way that they form a group consciousness. Okay? And that's what happens when you have these spiritually transformative experiences. You're interacting with other consciousnesses of these. Think of them as orbs, if you want to think of them. Think of them as clouds. And they are just a coherent ball that coheres together. And that is your soul. That is your mind. That is you. That's your identity, right? And you can have these group consciousnesses come together, and still it's mixing like purple paint and yellow paint, or I'm going to say yellow and blue to get green, right? Yellow and blue, you get the green, you get the effect of the combined. But then if you could pull the yellow and blue apart again, which you can, not in the physical world you can, I'm saying metaphorically you can, and that's what your consciousness is. It's coherent, and it coheres together even when you're interacting with something else, so you can act like a hierarchy of consciousness, group consciousnesses. And so your spirit guides are basically group consciousnesses that are helping you, usually a dozen to 200, a dozen to 20 to 30 to 100 group consciousnesses are all interacting, whispering in your ear all the time. This is how it's possible to do that, because they're not really isolated from each other. They just, where they put their attention to, they can combine in ways that are cooperating clouds of information. So, and here's another view of that. And so what is telepathy? is really just connecting of these things. And these little things, these little molecular structures here, this actually shows up in the math. These little things here, these little groups of groups and clusters, those would be called rotes, R-O-T-E-S. And that's what Robert Monroe says is a packet of meaning. So if you can have packets of meaning are built on these hyperbit clouds structures. And there's a whole geometric algebra explanation for that, but basically says it's not just a pile of dimensions, that these dimensions form structures. Like, think of it as atoms form molecules, primitive particles form atoms, and atoms form molecules. It's that idea, but at the quantum topology perspective. And we call those n vectors and hypervector and hypervectors. So essentially, they're clusters of this structure. So, you can't have a protein unless you have all that complicated substructure under there, okay? Which is what the basis for life is. Same thing is true here. So, you could have awareness. Robert Monroe would do remote viewing experiments, and he would say, when you did a remote viewing experiment, you would say, what is you're intending that you want information about the target. And so he says, when you do that, all of a sudden, here comes a packet, a rote, which is the answer you're seeking. And then you have to carefully unpack that thing without destroying it. You don't want to project your expectation on it. You want to actually get the information out of that little rote packet of meaning. And then that is the information that is the remote target information. So you're sending little packets like this, internet packets of thought, of mind. And so telepathy is real. And I think it's a key technology that's an information technology that's key to consciousness, more so than consciousness itself. And so, people don't necessarily realize how important that is. So, and here's another visualization. All these little things are clusters of rotes, these thought clusters, and they interact. And they're showing them as all separate here, but you can pull those into a bigger point that includes all of those. And that's why it's increasing complexity, not increasing frequency. In fact, the bigger this cluster is in hyperdimensional space, the slower is its frequency compared to Earth. In other words, Earth time looks like it's going slow. Excuse me, I better say it that way. And this is much higher. It's like you can't imprint this inside three-dimensional space-time because it doesn't fit from a dimensional perspective or from a time perspective. So a lot can happen here and no time has passed in the world, okay? It's because it has its own change frame here and dimensional frame here. And that's completely different than the relativistic framework that physicists talk about. So because there's no space-time here, so there's no metrics associated with that. So someday we'll have a mathematical representation equivalent to what we do with physics for relativity in a hyperdimensional space with no time. So that's part of what I'm working on. So here's another one, law of attraction, vortexes. Let's say you have an idea that you had a poor child, you had a bad childhood, and there you have all of the memories associated with that wrapped up in this little vortex of, this is out of the law of attraction. It talks about vortex of meaning. So if this is where you spend all your time, the poor little me story and things are not going to go my way, all your memories and thoughts are associated with this little vortex here. And so likewise, this could be your happy space here. So this is another one here. And they're two separate ones. It's almost like a schizophrenic thing where you can switch between these two. And so, but if you could produce a higher perspective, a higher frame, like this whole thing, and turn these two things so they're not so discriminating anymore. Think of this as a pothole. This one here, that's the negative one that you don't want anymore, is like a pothole in a road and you're stuck in it. Well, if you can go and fill the pothole and fill it in with, take all the positive stuff from here, fill in that positive pothole, fill the negative pothole with the positive stuff, then this becomes no pothole anymore, and it becomes the vortex that's you. Okay. And so meaning is a very strong subdivider for memories and emotions. So be aware of your emotional state and choose your emotional state because it affects which location in this hyperdimensional space you're spending all your time in. And there's a whole bunch of NLP techniques for moving this stuff around and flattening and filling these potholes. And I can talk to, if anyone needs to talk to me about it, they can do it separately. But so anyhow, these are all ideas that come from this hyperbit mind and vortexes. And by the way, this shows up in the mathematics of hyperdimensional spaces. These little vortexes, these are the bullseyes for subsets of the information. And when you, this is the, when they say you have to work on your dark side, this is integrating this part of you with the positive side of you and turning it all into one you instead of having sub pieces of you, sub personalities of you that each have their own subsets of memories. Okay. So hopefully that's a useful idea. So if you have complexity, so here's another model. You have this. I woke up with allergies this morning, so excuse me. So let's say you have this cloud here, this consciousness. Let's say this is you, each person, okay? And then in a little while, all of a sudden you have awareness. And so you're essentially increased awareness. This isn't more frequency. This is more complexity. It's like now you're bigger. You have a bigger complexity than you had before, right? And the same thing is true. You can increase your complexity again. So if this is humans, this might be angels, and this might be God, archangels up here, that they are increasing complexity. And so as long as we're in space-time, we're kind of limiting how much how much complexity that we can manage. And that's why we want to move up this hierarchy. This is the ladder of law of attraction, the emotional hierarchy, but it's also complexity. And in this, you are a savant in this state that combines all of these than if you were just in this state. So you're infinite intelligence. And in fact, infinite intelligence can't fit. If you have an infinite intelligence, you could tap into any information. You can't fit it into the physical world. It doesn't fit here. It won't fit. You can't put a million-dimensional space inside a three-dimensional space. It just doesn't fit. And so so this, remember, is infinite intelligence is due to increasing complexity with more dimensions in this cluster like this. And it's not about frequency. There's no space and time here. So there is no wavelength. There is no frequency here. You would maybe perceive this as color, but that's just a label that you're putting on it, but it's really not frequency based. There is no space and time metric here. So it's just increasing complexity. And this is what your consciousness does when you have a Kundalini awakening. All of a sudden you're opening yourself up to all of the stuff that's really there. It's just you're not paying attention to it most of the time. So humans are. So another important thing is time. Talked a little bit about some of this, but there's a whole bunch of things like entanglement is a common thing that people talk about in quantum computing, and entanglement is, and essentially they say spooky action at a distance. This is an idea, spooky action at a distance. Well, essentially you're violating time. You're violating the speed of light, which is time based. Okay, but you can have there's a whole. I don't know if you guys are interested in this stuff or not, but the life review that we've talked about, timeline therapy from NLP is all about having your consciousness look at time as though it's panoramic, and then going in and affecting your past life in this life or past lives, and healing yourself in the past by doing timeline therapy. It's from neurolinguistic programming, originally from the Hawaiians. It's actually an ancient Hawaiian technique. And so these are all time concepts, and we could go in. I would just like to talk for an hour just on time, but I think it's important to just make you aware that all of these are time-related concepts, and that there is no time in the universe, in the mind. It's really change-based. So there's a hyperdimensional space of change. Those are the space-time primitives of mind. And that's why you can have a life review that you experience your entire life and all the information in your life in the 5 minutes that you were having an NDE only 5 minutes really passed in our life, but you can have all this information. And so you perceive it as a very long time in the experience part of it, because our perception of time is related to information. That's why you can have a epic dream that's a whole life in the dream, and then you wake up 2 hours later from your night's sleep. So those are all related to time, is all relative too. So there is no absolute time. Okay. So ultimately, you can meet when you have a near-death experience, or whether you have it or not, but you can interact with other spiritual beings. And because these other spiritual beings exist in the hyperdimensional space, and they're going to interact with you. And so these are going to come in and help with you. These are your spirit guides, and they exist in this domain independent of space-time. And you just have to be aware and listen to them. And because they are helping us, there's a lot of people, a lot of spirit guides out there trying to help us. And so people are aware of those. And some of those helpers are even non-physical group consciousnesses that we would call from other galaxies and other solar systems in our galaxy. And so they are advanced spiritual beings, and they are trying to help Earth go through this awakening process right now. So be aware that this is all possible with this non-local hyperdimensional mind perspective. And these are all the group consciousness ideas. Here's Abraham of Esther Hicks and Abraham. Abraham labels himself as a group consciousness of 12 people, 12 souls. And there's another guy out there named Ken Lloyd, and he has a group of 22 consciousnesses that are interacting with him. And he's sort of a soul infused walk-in right now. So he's a lot of videos out there with him right now for people who are interested. Ken Lloyd, Ken Lloyd Official. He's both on Facebook and on websites. But group consciousness is an important thing, because it says our consciousness isn't limited to just individual consciousness. We are all connected. And group consciousness is a way of reminding you that. And you can get help from group consciousness. We've talked, I don't know if walk-ins is part of it, but most people think of the brain, I think of the brain as an antenna. So it's not really that the brain is the soul of consciousness, which is a lot of people that are working on microtubules and stuff are talking about, that the consciousness is emerged from the brain. But really, the consciousness exists outside the brain, and it's interacting with the brain. And so essentially, it's much bigger than the brain. And this is trying to be a pictorial representation of that. So all this stuff is the hyperdimensional space with all of the rotes in there and meaning and spirit guides and all this stuff. And we're all interacting with our brain. And so we can do that not only for memories and helpers from spirit guides, but people can actually do a walk-in where they say, I'm going to walk in, and this other person is going to allow me to do that. So the other thing that I'm working on is we call these wish units. Essentially, it's a device that looks like the size of a TV remote, and you just turn it on. It has a blue light on there, and when you turn it on, it generates these essentially hyperdimensional spheres, or snowflakes, if you want to think about it. It's structure that creates structure in the room and that permeates the room. And this structure is incompatible with lower level dimensional things. So in fact, I have one running in my room right now, right here. I don't know if you can see it there, but so if you're aware of that, you can be aware of that, and it fills the room, permeates the room. And so we use it for therapist's office and for personal growth and stuff like that. And so if you're interested in that, this is the website for that. And these essentially supports group consciousness, because if you're higher dimensional, you're going to be more in the intuitive group consciousness domain than you are going to be in the more classical worldview. So this is a consequence of this kind of model means that I helped co-found this company and supporting the availability of this class of technology, which is group consciousness technology, available to the people of the world. So So ultimately, this is that's why the name of my book is Deep Reality, because this stuff is deep, and survival of the non-brain mind and expanded awareness is all about this hyperbit cloud coherence model. And here's another model where it looks like snowflakes instead of orbs, for the coherent spaces, and my book on available on Amazon. And there's a website for the book, but it's essentially you buy it at Amazon. So, and of course, my website is quantumdoug.com. So you can find all my other talks, and this talk will be listed up there soon too, when the video is available. So, and so, Kundalini and expanded awareness is how, when we open up, we're saying somehow the interface between our body has changed, and it's not just our mind, and it's not just our brain, it's through the whole chakras, right? And so this is a representation to talk about that. And so it is. Anyone else have now any questions or comments? I'd like to hear some more stories about Kundalini if anybody has those. If not, yeah, go ahead. So I'm done speaking, and I can leave the slide up here, or I'll just stop sharing, and we can just have a conversation. So thanks for listening. Hopefully this was interesting.
Go ahead, Donna.
Go ahead, Donna.
Thank you so much, Doug. I could
Excuse me.
relate to
Go ahead.
so much of so much of what you said. Now, after the Kundalini fluid was released through my nervous system into the brain, I found myself researching many different aspects of quantum physics here on Earth, such as the Mandelbrot, Indra's web. I started to research the studies that were being done at CERN, regarding separating dark and light matter. And
Yeah.
I did, like what you have explained, find similarities.
Oh yeah.
Especially within the Mandelbrot. Some people refer to that as the thumbprint of God, the infinite pattern that goes on, and there's no time and space. And I could understand that intellectually for sure. But here's the thing. When the Kundalini fluid was released through the body, it's often referred to as nuclear power, but it's so much more.
It's information. They say God is both all knowing and all powerful. But if
Yeah.
you're all knowing, you're all powerful. So I would say it's the information side of the power comes from the knowing.
Well, I think that is half of the equation,
Okay.
but I think there's more.
Yeah.
And I think that comes through the experience itself.
Uh-huh.
Now, I know that this code, the divine code that humans have been searching for many generations, holds a different code completely.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where the Holy Scriptures and past books often refer to as God is in the blood.
Mm-hmm.
It's in your blood, it's in your DNA, and this DNA structure has to be activated to then act
Mm-hmm.
to then enter into these quantum codes. But
Yeah.
my worry is I completely agree that up to a certain point that we can understand through science, what you're explaining, Doug.
Yeah.
But without the
There's
actual
no
activity,
substitute for the experience, because once somebody's had this experience, then they want to try to understand what happened, right?
yeah.
So
But
you
then
can't
that can only take the individual so far as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And then we talk about how important the emotions are. There's something called cognitive empathy. And
Yeah.
this is where the human being can understand that another person is in pain. They can understand where that pain is rooted from. But can they truly feel that empathy within the body, within the heart, without actually trying to cognitively understand it? And I
Yes.
think then this is what makes us so very human, that that this DNA code that's been hidden from humanity for so long has this power in it that not only contains information, but contains the feeling, the flow pulsing through the blood. Now, if
Mhm.
AI could help us understand this, what happens one day if all of a sudden technology was to cease to exist? What happens then if we become reliant only on uh, information to take us so far? Would we then uh, have to fall down on our knees and surrender and to have to actually experience this DNA code through the body? Do you know what I
Mhm.
mean?
Yeah, I mean, I believe that the human is infinitely more intelligent, even in normal everyday life, not to mention, spiritually transformative experiences, than our technology, our current technology, right? So, I mean, I'm agreeing with you on that, and that's why I don't have to worry about AIs taking over the world. Um, we still want to put safeguards in there because we don't want AI killing machines being built for wars and stuff like that. Um, but I think that humans are infinitely intelligent, and by meditation, by lucid dreaming, by spiritual aware, working on your spiritual growth, you're tapping into more and more of your natural ability for infinite intelligence and emotional intelligence. And so empathy, if you can have a near death experience and you have a life review where you can experience the pain that somebody else experienced, the pain or joy that somebody else experienced as a result of your action in your earlier in your life, that is direct awareness and a connection about the emotion of the situation. How is that possible? And if it's only possible if the representation for emotion is in a place that's accessible without the body, right? And so, and it's part of the Akashic records, if you want to use that language, right? So, I'm saying, that's what happens in these spiritual transformations. That you open yourself to the ability to connect with these emotions, and those emotions are part of the meaning structure of this system. Emotion, you can't have love, you can't just label love. It's like it's like white or green. You can't just label it without having an experience for it, right? And so we're not talking about just labeling things, we're talking about actually experiencing. What does the taste of chicken actually taste like if you don't already know what that experience is, right? So I completely
Sure,
agree with
sure.
you that love is something that you really need to experience, and people say they experience in these spiritual transformative experiences
Yeah.
deep,
But if
infinite
we
love,
were, yeah,
unbounded love, right? And how is that
sure,
possible? Yeah.
sure. But if we were to experience that through AI, I don't
Yeah.
know if that would
No,
be
we won't.
no,
Won't.
no,
Don't
no.
have to worry about that. There's
Right,
my
Doug, right,
there's my
Doug.
prediction. So don't spend your time thinking about that, because it's just it's a false direction based on the classical success, the success of the classical worldview of AI,
Sure.
which is useful, but for don't put it in context of what it is, which is
Hmm.
it's a monkey. It's simulating,
Mm. Mm.
not having an actually real intelligence. So
And what about the gift of desperation to allow people to feel
they
a
want to
sense?
connect. They want to connect.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's yeah,
Well, you can have the want to connect without being desperate. You can just change your intention to say, I really want to connect, and here's the reason why, rather than say, I'm desperate to connect. It's the emotional label you put on your perspective. So, but anyway, so Matthew, you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, yes, thanks, Doug. You mentioned about getting language right, and on some levels that makes a lot of sense to me. But I'm interested in your some examples of what you mean by that. About um, you said communicating from when you talked about the scale below the Planck scale, and you said things the way things are structured or not structured there will lead to a better language to
Yeah.
use. Can you explain that a little bit more? What kind
Yeah.
of
I mean,
language are you talking? What should I change?
yeah. So that's why I would recommend my book, because I spend a lot of time in my book to say, look, there is no space and time, right? If there's no space and time, most people don't understand that if there's no space and time, then there's no such thing as wavelength. And wavelength is the basis for frequency, right? So if you have a wavelength and a frequency, both of those things are labels that we put on things that are associated with space-time metrics. Okay. Whereas if you have string theory, you say, I have this string and it's wobbling, but I don't have any space-time metric to put around it. So I can't tell you how long it is. I can't tell you its wavelength. And I can't tell you what its frequency is. I can tell you it has one node or two nodes. So I can tell you how complicated it is and what its modes are. But I can't tell you anything about its wavelength or its frequency. And so people always talk about, oh, consciousness to higher vibration, higher frequency consciousness. No, angels aren't higher frequency, they're higher complexity. So again, you want to stop using language that's space-time metric language and use the more generic language that consciousness is about vibration, not about frequency. And likewise, it's more about information than it is energy, because even though there's a connection between information and energy, this Landauer's principle and it from bit and those kinds of ideas, information it can exist without energy. So, my co-author for my book, Bill Tiller, who's, like I said, he's deceased. He created the term subtle energy in the 90s. He coined that term. Except that we don't call energy a subtle mass. Every time we talked about energy, we say, well, it's subtle mass. No. Likewise, here we have this notion of energy because we are vague about what we mean by it from a science perspective. And then we talk about the mind and stuff, we talk about subtle energy and healing and all this other stuff. We talk about subtle energy. No, subtle energy is different. It's not subtle energy. It's something else. It's prana. I would rather use the term prana than subtle energy, because subtle energy is kind of a mislabel of it, right? It's not energy at all. So those are two examples. Did that answer your question, or did it touch?
Somewhat. You raised it. There's something else you said that raised. I don't understand the difference between vibration and frequency. Could you give
Yeah.
me a little explanation of what the difference is?
Yeah. The best example is in string theory. They talk about these vibrating modes, a little string that's vibrating. Well, that only works if you want to put that vibrating node as a frequency. You have to say, well, how long is that? What's the distance there? But there's no distance metric. It's just a string that exists that's vibrating in a mode, but it doesn't have any space-time metric associated with it. It has more primitive characteristics other than frequency and wavelength or energy.
So vibrations just happening outside of space and time, and
Yeah, that's what
frequency
string theory is all about. String theory
frequency
says,
always has a wavelength.
well, no, it could have one trough, and have half a trough, one whole trough, two whole troughs. Those are the nodes in quantum computing, in quantum mechanics. Okay, those are the levels, the nodes, the n equals 1, Planck's level, n equals 1, n equals 2, n equals 3. It just tells you the number of nodes. It says something about the structure of it without talking about it as either a frequency or a wavelength.
So there was another thing that, because I don't understand a lot about quantum physics, but
Yeah.
the simple experiments were done seem to reveal a lot to me, like the double slit experiment where the results change if you change the observer, which kind of suggests that the consciousness is linked to reality outside of us. So the reality, so it's almost saying that it's one little clue to saying the reality that we think is inside here is actually outside as well, and we're intimately connected. And then when we come along to quantum entanglement, it suggests that even if this particle is very long distance away from each other,
The
it'll
two
act,
parts of it, yeah, the two
which it
parts of it.
also says that in reality, it looks like there's time and space, but actually beyond that, there isn't time and
Well,
space, and everything's connected.
yeah, yeah. So I'll give you a short description of entanglement to help clarify your comment. Okay. I don't know if it's a question, but it's a comment, so I'll go from that. But entanglement, it turns out mathematically, you have to have four dimensions to represent an entangled state in mathematics. And that's in the mathematics, the normal mathematics that they use for quantum computing, and in the math that I did for quantum computing that I call geometric algebra. It has four dimensions. The problem is a four-dimensional space can't exist inside three dimensions. So when we try to take a measurement of that entangled state and try to report the result that these two pieces are correlated, they're correlated in space-time, but the structure of it itself, the slinky model of this, it's actually a four-dimensional thing. So it looks non-local in three-dimensional space-time, but in four dimensions, it's local. So that's why there's not, if you take an entangled state and you separate it, there's nothing you can put between them that will cause that connection to disappear. No amount of lead, no amount of distance, no amount of anything. And so there's nothing in between it. It's a higher dimensional space that represents that set of relationships. And then we try to observe it within a 3D infrastructure. And that's when we see the spooky action at a distance problem that we label as a paradox, right? So it's not a paradox. It's trying to map a hyperdimensional thing into a lower dimension. And that's the kind of paradoxes you get. So another example I'll show you that's not even quantum computing. If you have entropy, if you have a box that has, let's say, a whole bunch of particles in it, and these particles have either a shape and or a color. You can randomly pick the shape or color for all these particles, let's say 100 of them. And if you have one observer say, I want to organize this so that all the red ones, let's say all the red ones are at the top and all the other colors are below. Let's say they have two colors and two shapes, okay? And they say, okay, then that's low entropy from this observer's perspective. But the other observer wants to look at it from the shape perspective. So it looks like high entropy over there. And it has nothing to do with quantum mechanics. It has to do with how we consider what's order. Okay. So, and then likewise, the other guy says, no, I want to organize this by shape. So he's going to put all the triangle ones on the top, but that's randomly choosing the color. So you can't have both the color and the shape simultaneously low entropy. One of them is the opposite of the other. Okay. And it has nothing to do with quantum mechanics. It has to do with high observer frames. So the mind, it turns out, can simultaneously look at both observer frames in a higher dimensional space. You can look at the observer frame of low entropy for color versus low entropy for shape simultaneously without violating entropy. And it's because we're in a higher dimensional space. So that's a new thing I've just realized recently that and quantum mechanics is somehow related to that. So non-commuting variables.
So the question I was coming to is that if those things appear to be true, there seems to be physical evidence now that suggests that space doesn't really exist the way we see it,
No,
and that my consciousness is intimately connected with everything that's out there. So as quantum computers are now becoming a thing, or before we get to that question, if that's true, that I'm intimately connected, and it's my consciousness that seems to be creating the consciousness is creating all these things. Do you believe? Yeah, do you believe that quantum computers is going to intimately connect with that consciousness?
No, I think it's more likely that we're going to have a quantum computer that our human mind will treat it like an artificial version of the brain, and we'll be able to control. I mean, imagine how we're controlling our mind. Our mind is controlling our brain. It's controlling it because it's basically manipulating the probability of the neurons firing. Okay, so I know to move my finger because I'm manipulating the probability of the neuron that controls my finger movement, right? But we're so reliable at it, we just don't imagine that it's probabilistic. Well, I believe that more belief is that humans, we're going to figure out a way to build a quantum interface that humans can interact with, so that without connecting to the brain directly, and that we can then use it as a surrogate. Like we could put it on Mars and we could still interact with it locally. And so we could treat it like a remote control robot that where mind could directly influence.
So one last question.
Did that make sense?
Yes, sure. One last
More
question.
so than quantum computers are going to be smart.
When you said, does it make sense? I'm saying sure, but on a limited level. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to happen. All I'm
Yeah, I don't
doing, well,
either.
it's almost as if God is, or whatever God is slowly revealing itself through quantum physics. It's
Quantum
slowly
computing.
getting so knock on the door saying, look, open your mind to this possibility, this reality. So my last question is, you've gone to a lot of extent in looking at how science can explain Kundalini and NDEs and
A
so
quantum mind model that supports those ideas. Yeah.
so I'd like to know, there must be some kind of benefit from understanding the scientific background behind all this. Like if you're coming from an ancient tradition, they would say, well, that's not that important. Just do go through the experience, make the connection to source, let it change you, let your consciousness expand, and that's all that's necessary.
Yeah.
So can you tell me how you think the scientific understanding behind it might help us?
Yeah. Like Robert Monroe is one of my heroes, and he was an explorer in consciousness, and he did remote viewing and out of body experiences. And he has classes, and I went the first time when he was still alive back in 1994 to the Monroe Institute for several classes there. So I've been like 4 or 5 times to the Monroe Institute for a week at a time. And one time there was a monk who was visiting one of these classes, and the monk said, well, usually the classes start on Friday and they go through the following Friday. Okay, so it's a week there in residence. And the monk said, on Wednesday, we got to a state that would take us 20 years to get to if we were just sitting in the mountains meditating. And so the question is, can you use technology to accelerate this experiential side of it? And so I believe the answer is yes. And so we don't need to wait 20 years. We can accelerate this by using things like hemisync and meditation, and we can accelerate it. I'm not recommending having a near-death experience. not by choice anyhow. So the question is, how can we awaken to this who we really are in as quickly a time as we can, so that we can experience heaven on earth while we're still in this body. Otherwise we have to wait till the next lifetime. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but it's
Absolutely. Is Robert Monroe, is he anything to do with the gateway?
Yeah, the gateway. Yeah, and the lifelines classes,
meditations.
Yeah. He has hemisync tapes, which is his trademark name for the bilateral beats.
Different frequencies of beats. Yeah.
Slightly different, so it produces this the difference frequency in the corpus callosum, and that induces alpha states and beta states in the brain, low frequency. And so yeah, I mean, I've been there and I've communed with 4-leaf clovers and talked to them, telepathically connected with 4-leaf clovers and 5-leaf clovers, and they talk back to me and I talk to them and talk to my spirit guides there. So he's had a major impact on the spiritual awakening of the whole planet, because a lot of people who are in this field got their boost there. So I would recommend, if you've never gone, go.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Doug. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah. So I believe the final merging, the light that you showed at the top of the tunnel,
Yeah.
I don't believe it has anything to do with consciousness.
Yeah.
And I believe that it's when alpha and omega are joined together. There's no gender, there's no light.
Yeah.
I think what you're saying, Doug, is remarkable to give people some understanding of what has happened, which is wonderful work. Wonderful.
Yeah.
I really respect
Otherwise,
that.
people can't talk about it either if they don't have
Sure,
a
sure. But I think,
ineffable.
sure,
Can't talk
sure,
about it.
sure, yeah. But I think when it comes to the final merge, that light at the top of the tunnel, I don't think that anything else can take us to that final merge without surrendering and releasing the Kundalini fluid through the body, and really becoming one with
I'm
that.
going to ask you a question. So, I mean, you know maybe more about Kundalini than I do. So let's say there's an NDE kind of experience, okay? But then there's somebody else has a Kundalini experience, right? Where they definitely feel the serpent arising, and the Kundalini rising and stuff like that. But yet you can have very similar experiences from both of those. But a person who has a near-death experience doesn't necessarily have the Kundalini rising.
Well, they do actually, Doug.
Okay. So explain that to me in a way that I can understand.
Sure. So what happens when a person has an NDE is that the Kundalini fluid is released through the nervous system, up the spine, through every parts of the body, and enters the brain. And because people have not had an understanding of what is going on, the brain automatically attaches perhaps an experience of a tunnel. Now, the Kundalini path is exactly the same, except when the person is perhaps meditating and they release the fluid through the body, they don't actually have to attach a tunnel vision because they're feeling it go through the body. Whereas when the person dies, they're not feeling anything really in the body, although it's all
because they're
happening.
disconnected from the body. So
Absolutely, but it's
so
still
maybe
happening.
so maybe the Kundalini is having that experience without disconnecting from the body, and the NDE is when you disconnect from the body.
Yeah, and so very
Is that reasonable?
absolutely, Doug, absolutely. But it's the same fluid that's released through meditation, through a life crisis, and also through an NDE. There's absolutely no difference. But we often hear.
So I'm going to ask you a question about that. So
Sure.
is this a prana fluid or a physical fluid, like central nervous system fluid?
Well, it's both. I mean, it has many.
But it doesn't have. It could be. Let's say it's not a physical phenomena, but it's a metaphoric phenomena that happens at the prana level. So that prana is unmeasurable. It's from a science perspective, it doesn't exist. So I'm saying you can't measure prana rising. You can't even measure prana exists. So I'm saying you experience as though it's fluid, but I'm saying it's in the metaphoric domain is what I'm suggesting. So part of it is your language calling it the fluid. Again, it's like saying, well, it's electromagnetic. Well, it's neither physical fluid nor physical electromagnetic, but it feels electrical and it feels like it's flowing, but it's in the prana domain.
Sure.
So I'm saying, here's an example where your language may be limiting what you're expecting, because you make it sound as though it's a physical thing.
Well, it is
and I
a
should
physical
just be able to
thing.
inject it in my body and do the same thing, which is not going to happen. Right?
Sure, and it is a physical thing. This fluid is at the bottom of your spine.
Yeah.
Contained within certain organs, and when released, it travels up to the brain, to the pineal gland, and activates different levels of consciousness. So it's very physical as well, but trying to bring the physical forth into something that's tangible. But this is where we have remarkable accounts of, people bringing forth prophecies of the future.
See, all the prophecy stuff, I get that, but it isn't due to an actual liquid. Because if it was an actual liquid, we would be able to physically inject it in people to produce this phenomena. So I'm saying that it's like, don't use the word frequency, use the word vibration. Don't use
No,
the
I
word fluid, use
understand.
the word
I
prana. Because
understand that,
again,
Doug.
I'm just
Yeah.
trying to say, don't limit what you're talking about as though it's physical. A lot of people are trying to say, well, the pituitary gland is everything,
Mhm.
like famous other people who are out there, they say meditating in pituitary gland, pituitary gland, pituitary gland. Well, you can do all of that without having any connection with the pituitary gland, right? You can, so they're trying to rationalize it as a physical phenomenon that gives this. Same thing
Mhm.
with microtubules as the basis for consciousness. They're saying,
Mhm.
here's the physical explanation for consciousness. Here's the physical
Mhm.
explanation for Kundalini rising. And I'm
Mhm.
saying it's not physical in the sense of this kind of physical. It's in the prana domain. It's in this hyperspace. It's in an
Mhm.
area that you can't physically measure it, which is why it's still not considered part of science.
Of course, and it is, and I
It's
totally
real.
agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Doug.
It's an
Absolutely.
experience that's real for the people who are
Sure,
having it.
sure.
Yeah, but it's
And
not
it's,
physical, this kind of physical.
I think it's everything, Doug. I think physical to
Well,
me
once you have this
feeling
experience,
something.
you feel like you're God and you're all powerful. So you can't imagine that you couldn't do anything.
Sure, sure. And we
Yeah.
can
So
see great works being done at the moment with
yeah,
human
exactly.
DNA and the blood and stuff. But even then, science can only take that so far. We see humans being
Yeah, it's still
cloned,
experience. Yeah.
being
If we
cloned,
can
and
use science to leverage our ability to experience this stuff, then we
yeah,
know we know it. We don't have to guess or have a model of it anymore. We just know it. That's the
sure,
difference.
sure, sure, sure.
So Matthew, go ahead. Go ahead. Just speak up, Matthew.
Yeah. So again, I don't have any tangible, real experience, but I things make sense to me. And like the samadhi, the kundalini, and the NDE experiences seem to be a dissociation from the body. They generally forget that they're in the isolated body and go out of that and become more connected with the outer inner. Well, maybe
Yeah.
there's no outer or no inner, but more connected to the real source potentially. So that they
Yeah,
all
exactly.
probably
Your
are
true
very
nature.
similar. They're probably all very similar anyway. And maybe whether we all can argue about physical or non-physical, if consciousness is creating this anyway, there could be something beyond physical that's even more real, where the the energy is rising and we are being activated.
Yeah.
So,
The
so,
awareness and complexity is increasing so that we have this experience that we are aware of all this stuff.
so it's even more real to us, even
Yeah.
if you can't get a syringe into the spine and draw the fluid
Yeah.
out,
Yeah.
it's there in a physical form,
Yeah.
for us because it's actually happening on in a place in consciousness that's beyond physical, but even more
Yeah.
real to us.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like a lucid dream that's more real than our physical world, you know, in that same way. So did you have a comment? Was that a comment or a question? I didn't.
I think it was more about a kind of a roundup of what you were all
Okay.
talking about to try
Yeah,
and bring
exactly.
some sense to me,
Yeah,
which kind of makes sense to me.
that's cool.
Because things for me when I they have to be much more simple. Early on in the presentation, though, you were talking about different principles and laws, like the land. There was one with your name on one principle,
Yeah, Matsky
land.
principle.
And it's like at those times, either I need more explanation of how they apply to this, or else it's just like it goes over my head
Uh-huh.
and it doesn't seem to link to what we're actually talking about. When we're talking about what Robert Malone's done with uh, even the Hemisync and the Gateway meditations makes some sense to me, where you've got two different frequencies, and
Yeah,
the difference between those two creates a very low frequency, which potentially sends you into this state.
yeah, yeah. The state, yeah,
And it's been proven and shown, which kind of, so it would be useful for me to kind of understand on a I know you say it's very deep, but for me, when I kind of understand things, it becomes quite simple.
yeah,
It's not complex. There might be lots and lots of things that become complex, but the
yeah.
actual subject and understanding, it's a bit like quantum physics to me. Just seems like the universe or consciousness itself letting us know that it more about itself,
Yeah.
and and so and all I kind of know from my own limited understanding is all this quantum computing will eventually develop into something. Anything that
Okay.
grows, whether it's nature, whether it's plants, whether it's quantum computing, whatever it is, becomes something. It
Mhm.
becomes something and then deteriorates and dies. But whilst it's expanding and growing, it's becoming something. And so I'm interested to see what it's going to become.
Yeah, exactly. Well, people are working on AI and quantum computing. They want to use quantum compute. I mean, the one thing about quantum computing that really kicked it all off was literally 21 years ago. Peter Shor came up with an algorithm that if you ran it on a quantum computing, the math of the quantum computation perfectly matched the solution to this problem. How he figured that out, I don't know, but it was insightful. And he basically showed that you can solve this problem with a quantum algorithm that you can't solve with any classical algorithm because of this matching of the properties of the solution to the mathematical properties of quantum computing. And so it's called Shor's algorithm. And he got special awards and everything for this. And it started the big spending in quantum computing back 30 years ago. And now 10, $20 billion a year are spent in quantum computing because nobody wants to miss out on the fact that quantum computing is fundamentally different. But so far, they haven't figured out anything useful to do with it. And I can say that because I have a PhD in quantum computing, and I'm going, well, that isn't going to go anywhere. They're developing all the technology, but they haven't done anything with it yet, except, and they haven't scaled yet either. So they can't even solve the big problems that they really want to solve with it yet. So they're coming up the learning curve on that. So that's why, it's always, it's like AI. It's always 10 years away.
Mm. Well, and it's quite likely that we'll find out later what the potentials are
Yeah,
of
yeah,
this new technology.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So, well, this has been interesting. And thank you both for your questions and comments and your support. And like I said, if you're interested in, you know, go read my book. And if the technology part of it is just skim through that and try to pick up the concepts, and or go just listen to my talks on my website, quantumdog.com. And there's topics. There's a similar one to this, and there's one that are more technical, and so you can pick and choose. But I'm trying to educate people how to think about this in a way that just doesn't assume the same assumptions that all the regular people who are assume the brain is a classical computer, and that's it. That's not doesn't solve the problem of consciousness. So
Before we
we
end,
actually see a picture for Sierra. Did you have another comment, Sierra, or are you? Is that
No,
how you?
no, I'm okay. I'm happy. I missed some of the thing because the house is very busy today, so I'll have to listen to the replay.
Okay. Well, thank
Okay,
you.
thank
Thank
you.
you. Yeah. So thank you, everyone. If you have any more questions, I'll let you all go. And it's been fun.
Yeah, I just want to say, Doug, just ask you, the final merging, I don't believe has got anything to do with consciousness at all. Would
Uh-huh.
you agree with that?
Yeah, I believe the use of the word consciousness is kind of like a mislabel also, because this is awareness of awareness, which is, we could call it our soul, we could call it our mind, we could call it the sum of all of those things, those properties, the thing that survives beyond our physical body, whatever you want to call that. What is its properties? And it's more informational oriented than energy oriented, because it's all its properties are information centric, you know. So this is what I'm looking at, the fundamental aspect of who we are, and people use the term consciousness to talk about it. So I agree with you that consciousness is sort of not a great term for it.
Do we have another term that we could?
Yeah,
we
thanks,
could,
Doug.
Well, that's
we have
why I call it
another term?
hyperbit cloud mind. You know, it's doesn't, you know, you could put mind or soul or essence or being or whatever you want to put as the noun, but its structure, it has to be a hyperbit cloud because of the properties that it exists with. It has to have those properties. And if you want to put more adjective, it's a space-like hyperbit cloud. And so those are big terms with a lot of compact, short words to describe big concepts. And so
Maybe there's no words. Maybe there are no
yeah,
words that can
it's
describe
God.
it.
God is ineffable. Even little g or big G, either one is ineffable. And if people have a near-death experience, they can hardly talk about it when they come back. It's like kind of talk about a dream that they have when they come back. It's like they can't put it in words, you know. So what is it that you can experience something and not put it into words? Well, words are about putting it in time. Well, if you have something that's a hyperdimensional structure and you're trying to put it in time as a sequential series in a set of limited coded words, there's no words for it. The words hasn't been invented yet for it, maybe even. And so, yeah, and you may have been downloaded with equations that we don't know about yet. You know, if let's say it's math, you know, so can we download stuff? People get downloads all the time, yeah, and I'm interested in that too, and that's part of this meeting, you know. So those are all things, and if our mind really doesn't exist in our physical reality, then we've existed either in other planets or galaxies, solar systems and galaxies, you know, that it may be that there's a lot more life out there than we expect. You know, this perspective that we're the only beings in the entire universe on Earth, you know, which is not true. You can't believe that anymore. So
Thank you.
again, it's fun talking about this stuff, and I appreciate you guys listening in on this conversation and contributing. So that's great.
Well, thank you so much, Doug.
Yeah. And Donna, I love what you're doing with the group. I don't know how you have time to do anything else because you're just posting all the time on that group.
I'm just so passionate, Doug. I'm so
Yeah.
passionate to get back to that place that was so glorious,
Yeah.
you know, and I appreciate everyone and all of you. I really do.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And if you would, and like I said, if you want more, I know Buddha Betty is on your list. And I had an interview with her that has a lot of these same topics in it back on my quantumdoug.com website. So if you just go look for the Buddha Betty.
Oh,
ions,
we know already, Doug.
We watched it.
Yeah. So, I mean,
Yeah.
like I said, and I've talked several times for ions already. So, yeah. Okay. Well, thanks again, everybody. Matthew, you can stop the recording if you want. And
all good. Thank you very much.
Appreciate. Let me know when you have a video on YouTube somewhere that I can link to it.
We'll probably post it in the group first, Doug, and let everyone.
Thank you, Doug.